My father had a saying he used whenever something went wrong around the house. He'd look at whatever was broken, a leaky tap, a cracked fence post, a mower that wouldn't start, and he'd say, "It's just a thing, son. Things can be fixed. It's people that matter." I heard that saying so many times growing up that I stopped really listening to it. You know how it is with the things your parents repeat. They wash over you after a while. You nod. You move on. You forget. I was 63 years old before I truly understood what he meant. My name is Gerald. I'm 66 now, retired, living in Tauranga. I spent 32 years as a civil engineer for the regional council. Decent career, reasonable salary. A life that looked, from the outside, pretty much the way a life is supposed to look. I have one son. His name is Damien. He's 38. He works in commercial property in Auckland. He married a woman named Fiona about 6 years ago. Nice wedding. Venue overlooking the harbor. 3-tier cake. Speeches that went on a bit too long but meant well enough. And I have my father. His name is Reginald Reg to everyone who knows him, and he turned 79 last August. He still lives in the house where I grew up, a weatherboard place in Rotorua with a lemon tree in the backyard that he planted the year I was born. That tree is still producing. My father tends to it like it's a member of the family, which in some ways I suppose it is. After my mother passed 7 years ago now, a stroke. Very sudden, my father lived alone. He insisted on it. He was fiercely independent in the way that generation tends to be. He cooked his own meals, drove himself to the shops, mowed his own lawn until I finally convinced him to let a young fellow from down the road do it. He had his routines, and he kept to them with the kind of quiet discipline that I always admired, and frankly could never quite match myself. Damien and Fiona visited when they could. Christmas, usually. The occasional long weekend. It wasn't frequent, but it was regular enough that I didn't worry. My father never complained. He'd say Damien was busy, that Auckland was a long drive, that young people had their own lives to get on with. He said it without bitterness. He meant it. What I didn't know, what I wouldn't find out until much later, was that my father had been keeping a quiet record of things in his mind. Not grudges, exactly. More like observations. He'd always been that way. A careful man. A man who watched and listened and drew his own conclusions, without making a noise about it. I should have been paying closer attention. The night everything changed was a Thursday in the middle of winter. June. Cold down in Rotorua, in a way that gets into your bones if you're not prepared for it. I was at home in Tauranga, about an hour and a half's drive away, when my phone rang just after 9:30. It was my father. He didn't ring often in the evenings. That alone made me sit up straight. "Gerald," he said, and his voice was different, quieter than usual, a little careful. "Dad, you all right?" There was a pause. Not long, but long enough. "I've had a bit of a fall," he said. My stomach dropped. I asked him where, how, whether he'd hit his head. He told me he'd been coming down the hallway from the bathroom, caught his foot on the edge of the rug, the same rug that had been there for 40 years, the rug my mother bought at a market in Hamilton, and gone down hard on his right side. He thought his wrist was broken. Maybe his hip. He wasn't sure about the hip, but something didn't feel right. I was already standing, already reaching for my keys. "Have you called an ambulance?" I asked. "I was hoping to avoid that fuss," he said. I told him to call one immediately, and that I was on my way. He started to argue, the way he always did. Said not to drive in the dark. Said he'd be fine. Said the ambulance would sort it out, and I didn't need to come all the way from Tauranga at this hour. I didn't argue back. I just said, "I'll be there, Dad," and hung up. My wife, Sandra, was already in the doorway with my coat. We've been married 39 years. She handed me the coat without a word, kissed me on the cheek, and told me to drive carefully. I don't know what I'd do without that woman. I rang Damien from the car. He answered on the third ring. I could hear noise in the background, voices, music, the particular echo of a restaurant or a bar. "Dad," he said, and I could hear him step somewhere quieter. "What's up?" I told him about Granddad. The fall, the wrist, the hip. That I was driving to Rotorua now, and I'd know more once I got there, and the hospital had looked him over. "God," Damien said. "Is he okay?" "I don't know yet," I said honestly. "I think it might be serious. His hip concerns me." There was a pause. Then he said, "Right. Okay. Let me know what the hospital says." I waited for more than that. I waited for him to say he'd come, or at least ask if I needed him to come. He didn't. "I'll keep you posted," I said, and left it at that. I drove to Rotorua in just under 90 minutes. The ambulance had already taken my father in by the time I arrived at his house. His neighbor, a good woman named Margaret, who was in her 70s herself, had followed them to the hospital and sat with him in emergency until I got there. I will be grateful to Margaret for that until my last day. His wrist was fractured. That was confirmed quickly enough. The hip was more complicated. A partial fracture, they told me. Not displaced, which was fortunate. But serious enough that they wanted him admitted, monitored, rested. If things didn't stabilize, they'd be talking surgery. My father lay in that hospital bed looking smaller than I'd ever seen him. He was wearing one of those gowns that never quite fit properly, and his arm was elevated. And he had the expression of a man trying very hard not to show that he was frightened. I sat beside him and held his good hand and told him we were going to sort this out together. He nodded. He didn't say much. That was when I understood he was more shaken than he was letting on. I rang Damien again from the corridor. This time Fiona answered. Damien had handed her the phone. Apparently, I told her what the hospital had confirmed. The fractures, the admission, the possibility of surgery. "Oh, that's awful," Fiona said. "Poor old Reg." I asked if Damien could come down at the weekend. Not to stay long, just to see him. To let him know his grandson was there. My father hadn't said anything about it, but I knew it would mean a great deal to him. There was a pause on the line. "This weekend's actually pretty tricky," Fiona said. "We've got Jamie and Priya's thing on Saturday. They've been planning it for months. And Sunday, we've got the Hendersons coming for lunch. We'd already committed." I stood in that hospital corridor with the fluorescent lights humming above me and the smell of disinfectant in the air, and I said, very carefully, "Fiona, his hip might need surgery. He's 79 and he's on his own and he had a fall. I'm not asking you to move in. I'm asking if Damien can come for an afternoon." Another pause. "I'll talk to him," she said. "I'll see what we can do." She said it the way people say things when they've already decided the answer is no. I walked back into my father's room and sat with him until he fell asleep. Then I found a chair in the family waiting area and I sat there until morning. Damien texted at some point after midnight. 3 lines. "Hope Granddad's okay. Let me know if things get worse. We'll try to get down next weekend if we can." Next weekend. I read that text twice. Then I put my phone in my pocket and looked at the wall and thought about my father's saying. About things and people. About what matters. My father was in hospital for 11 days. I drove to Rotorua 4 times during that period. Sandra came with me twice. We brought him books, his radio from home so he could listen to the cricket, a proper pair of pajamas, because he found the hospital gowns undignified. We brought him sliced kiwi fruit in a container because the hospital fruit was always mealy and he had strong opinions about fruit. Damien came once. Day 8. He stayed for 2 hours and spent a portion of it on his phone outside in the car park. My father said nothing about it. He shook Damien's hand when he arrived and thanked him for coming. He was gracious. My father. He always was. Fiona did not come. She sent a card, to be fair. One of those generic get-well cards with flowers on the front. She signed it with both their names. My father put it on his bedside table and didn't mention it. When my father was discharged, I organized everything. A physio twice a week, Meals on Wheels to start, then Sandra and I doing a proper cook-up every Sunday and dropping it round. A grab rail in the bathroom, a new mat in the hallway, that particular rug went in the bin, and a medical alert pendant that he wore around his neck, and complained about constantly, but kept wearing because I asked him to. He recovered well, all things considered. Better than the doctors expected, honestly. He was stubborn in the most useful way, my father. He did his exercises every morning without fail. He was walking without the frame within 6 weeks. During those weeks, I was at his place often. Damien called occasionally. Fiona, rarely. Life, as far as they were concerned, seemed to have returned to normal. But something had shifted for me. I began to notice patterns I'd been explaining away for years. Christmases where Fiona made it clear she was only there under sufferance. Phone calls Damien never returned until 2 or 3 days later. Birthdays acknowledged with a text. My father's 80th birthday, a milestone, surely celebrated with a lunch that Damien and Fiona arrived 40 minutes late to and left early from because Fiona had a headache. My father smiled and said it was lovely and meant it, because he was that kind of man. I had been explaining these things away for years, telling myself that Auckland was busy, that young people had their priorities, that Fiona wasn't close to us, and that was fine. It didn't have to mean anything. After the hospital, I stopped explaining it away. About 4 months after my father came home from hospital, I rang Damien on a Sunday evening. Sandra was in the garden. I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, and I told my son that I wanted to have a proper conversation with him about his grandfather. Damien said, of course. I told him what I'd observed. Not with anger, I was careful about that. I told him that his grandfather was 79, that he lived alone, that he had fractured his hip and his wrist and spent 11 days in hospital, and that during that time Damien had visited once for 2 hours. I told him that I understood he had a life in Auckland and that I wasn't asking him to drop everything, but that I thought his grandfather needed to feel that his grandson cared whether he was alive or not. There was a long silence. Then Damien said, Fiona finds it hard. I asked him what he meant by that. He said that Fiona and Grandad had never really clicked, that she felt uncomfortable at his place, that the drive was long and the visits were difficult for her. I sat with that for a moment. I said, Damien, your grandfather is 79, and he's had a serious fall. I'm not asking Fiona to click with him. I'm asking you, as his grandson, to show up. Damien said he understood, that he'd do better, that things had been hectic but he'd make more of an effort. He said it the same way Fiona had said it in the hospital corridor. In that particular tone, that means the conversation is being managed rather than heard. 2 weeks later, Damien rang me. He didn't ring to talk about his grandfather. He rang to tell me that he and Fiona were looking at a property in Rotorua and that they needed to move quickly because there was strong competition and they were short on deposit by about $40,000. He asked if I could help. I was quiet for long enough that he asked if I was still there. I said I was still there. I told him I needed to think about it and that I'd come back to him. I talked to Sandra that night. Sandra, who says very little, but always says exactly the right thing. She sat across the table from me and she listened to all of it. The hospital, the visits, the phone call, the request. And when I'd finished, she said, Gerald, you already know what you think. You're just deciding whether to say it. She was right. She usually is. I rang Damien back the next day. I told him I wasn't going to help with the deposit. I told him why. I told him that money was something I thought about carefully, and that one of the things I thought about was what kind of son and grandson a person chose to be. That I had watched him be largely absent during a serious crisis for his grandfather, and that I had to be honest with him about the fact that it had affected my thinking. Damien went very quiet. Then he said, "I can't believe you're using money as a weapon." I said I wasn't using it as anything. I was just being honest with him about where I was. He said it was unfair, that I was punishing Fiona for not visiting when Fiona wasn't a blood relative, and I couldn't expect her to feel the same obligations. That Granddad had never really made Fiona feel welcome anyway. I listened to all of it. I let him say everything he wanted to say. Then I said, "Damien, I love you. I will always love you. But I'm not going to pretend this doesn't matter when it does." He hung up. Fiona rang me 40 minutes later. Her tone was different to what I expected. Not upset. Exactly. More controlled. Careful. She said she thought there had been a misunderstanding, and that she and Damien both cared deeply about the family, and that the situation with the hospital had been unfortunate, but they'd both been dealing with a lot. I thanked her for ringing. She asked again about the deposit. I said my answer hadn't changed. The silence that followed was the kind that has a shape to it. I could feel her recalibrating. Then she said, "Gerald, I think you should know that Reg actually mentioned to Damien a few months ago that he'd been updating his will. Damien didn't think it was worth mentioning at the time, but I think it's relevant now." I asked her why she thought it was relevant. She said, "Carefully, I just think we should all be on the same page. Family should communicate." I understood then exactly what she was communicating. I said, "Fiona, I appreciate the call," and I ended the conversation. I rang my father that evening. I didn't mention the will. I just wanted to hear his voice. We talked about the cricket. We talked about the lemon tree. It had produced a bumper crop that season. He said, best he could remember, he'd been making lemon honey. Told me he'd put a couple of jars aside for me. Towards the end of the call, without any particular lead-up, he said, "I've made some changes, sorted out a few things. I wanted you to know." I told him I trusted him completely. He said, "I know you do, son." That's been the point. I didn't ask him anything more. It wasn't my business to ask. 3 months passed. Damien and I spoke a handful of times, careful conversations, polite, the kind that stay on the surface. He and Fiona visited Rotorua once in that period, and overnight. My father rang me afterwards and said it had been nice, that Damien had mowed the lawn and Fiona had been perfectly pleasant. He said it without irony and without subtext, and I believed him. My father had the remarkable quality of not holding things against people. He observed them. He drew his conclusions. He made his arrangements accordingly, but he didn't carry bitterness. It was something I'd always marveled at. The following February, my father had a routine checkup with his GP, and they found something on his lung that needed further investigation. I drove down immediately. Sandra came with me. We sat in the waiting room while he had the tests, and I thought about the lemon tree and the cricket and the lemon honey he'd put aside for us, and I told myself to stay steady. It turned out to be less serious than feared scar tissue, the specialist thought, from a chest infection years back. We exhaled. My father was characteristically calm about all of it. He said he'd thought it was probably nothing. I said I hadn't thought that at all. Damien and Fiona sent a message when I told them the results were good. A voice message from Damien. "Glad to hear it. That must have been a stressful couple of days. Send Grandad our love. Send Granddad our love." My father was 79 years old. He'd had a serious fall and a hip fracture. He'd just had a lung scare. And his great-grandson, who was 2 years old by then, Damien's boy, little Marcus, had met him 4 times. 4 times in 2 years. I thought about that a lot in those weeks. I thought about the kind of man Reg had been. The kind of father he was to me. The Saturday mornings he'd taken me fishing, even though he had things to do. The way he'd driven 3 hours to watch me play a regional rugby final when I was 16 and said nothing afterwards when we lost badly, just put his hand on my shoulder in the car park and bought me a pie. The 23 years he'd cared for my mother through her illness and then through her death. The way he still put fresh flowers in the vase on her dressing table, which he hadn't changed since she died, because he thought she'd have liked them. That man was sitting alone in a weatherboard house in Rotorua, tending his lemon tree, making lemon honey, waiting for the phone to ring. I am not a man given to displays of emotion. Sandra will tell you that readily. I rarely cry. I don't make speeches. I say what I mean, and I try not to say more than that. But I will tell you that in those weeks I felt something settle in me. Not anger, though there had been anger earlier. More like clarity, a clear-eyed understanding of who the people in my life had shown themselves to be and what I was going to do about it. My father's health remained stable through the rest of that year and into the next. He moved more slowly, was tired more easily, but his mind was sharp and his spirit was unchanged. We got into the habit of talking every morning, just briefly, while he had his first cup of tea of the day and I had mine. Nothing important, usually. The weather, what he'd had for dinner, what he was reading. But I want you to understand that those phone calls mattered more to me than almost anything. He passed on a Tuesday morning in early spring, quietly, in his own bed, at the age of 81, the way he would have wanted. His neighbor Margaret found him when he didn't answer his door for the morning paper, and she rang me, and I drove down one last time. I sat in his kitchen for a long time before I rang anyone. The lemon tree was just outside the window, budding again. There was a jar of lemon honey on the bench with a piece of tape on the lid that said Gerald in his handwriting. When the estate was settled, several weeks later, my father's intentions became clear. He had left the house and the majority of his estate to me and to my sister Christine, who lived in Dunedin and had visited him faithfully every few months for years. He had left a specific sum to Margaret, his neighbor, with a note that said simply, "Thank you for your kindness." He had left a smaller sum in trust for little Marcus Damien's boy to be accessed when Marcus turned 21. He had left Damien a handwritten letter and a photograph, the two of them at a family Christmas when Damien was about 9, out in the back garden with the lemon tree behind them, both of them grinning in the sun. There was nothing for Fiona. There was a note in the will, in my father's careful handwriting, that said, "I have thought about each person in my life and what they gave freely. I have tried to reflect that clearly. I have no ill will toward anyone. I hope they find their way to what matters before it is too late." Damien rang me the day after the will was read. He didn't say much about the money. To his credit, he didn't say much about any of it. He was quiet on the phone in a different way than he usually was. Not calculating, just quiet. He said, "I didn't realize. I didn't say anything right away. I let the silence be there." Then he said, "I thought there'd be more time. I always thought there'd be more time." And I understood that this was true. I understood that he had told himself the same things I had once told myself, that there was always next weekend, always a better time, always a trip that would happen eventually. I understood that my son was not a bad person. He had simply been careless with time in the way that most people are, until suddenly there is no more of it. I said to him, "Dad would have liked to hear you say that," and Damien cried. He cried in a way I hadn't heard from him since he was a boy, and I sat with that, with all of it, with the weight of what couldn't be undone, and the small mercy of the fact that he understood it now. I told him about the morning phone calls, about the cricket and the lemon tree and the honey on the bench. I told him that his grandfather had never, not once, spoken badly of him to me, that he had always found something to say on Damien's behalf, that the photograph he'd left him had been chosen deliberately. I was certain of it, because in it Damien was laughing, and Reg was laughing, and the lemon tree was behind them, and whatever happened later, that moment had been real. Marcus is 4 now. Damien and his family have moved from Auckland to Hamilton, which is not far from Rotorua. They visit my father's old house. Sometimes Christine and I still own it. We're not ready to sell it yet, and Damien takes Marcus out to look at the lemon tree. I go down when I can. We have our cup of tea, and I try to tell Marcus things about his great-great-grandfather. That he was a careful man. That he paid attention. That he had a saying. It's just a thing, son. Things can be fixed. It's people that matter. I'm 66 years old, and I know now that those words contain most of what you need to know about how to live. The mistake most of us make, the one I made, the one Damien made, is thinking we'll apply them later, after this weekend, after this deal goes through, after things settle down. But people are not like leaky taps. You cannot fix them after the fact. You can only show up while they're still here. You can only choose right now, today, with the time that is actually in your hands, what kind of son or daughter or parent or grandchild you are going to be. My father spent 50 years tending a lemon tree he planted the year I was born. He pruned it and fed it and watered it in the dry summers. He did it quietly, without fuss, without expectation of recognition. And every year, without fail, it gave back more than he put in. That is a kind of wisdom I am still learning, but I am learning it. And that, I think, is where we have to start.